There are very few subjects that capture the imagination and the billions of dollars in funding that the art of camouflage has encapsulated over the centuries. Military units all over the world have spent the past century developing the absolute best camouflage patterns, fabrics, colors, textures, materials, and doctrine, and not without good reason. An enemy that cannot be seen cannot be targeted. Well, in most cases anyway. So today we're going to dip our toes into the ocean of camouflage once again and discuss a very specific field of technology, camouflage detection. And to begin this journey, we have to make a pit stop in a farmer's field in Africa. Over the centuries, Africa as a continent has suffered from widespread famine and crop failure. Millions of people have died from food insecurity that is directly related to various environmental effects, which in turn is a major contributing factor for conflict. So one very interesting bit of technology that can help us with this is what we call multispectral or hyperspectral imagery. So what does this mean? Well, again, this is a gargantuan field of technology, so wide-ranging in its applications that it's almost easier to show what it can do rather than define it with words. But in this case, when it comes to our specific topic today, multispectral imagery is imagery, photographs or video, but usually still images, that are taken using optical sensors like a camera. But instead of capturing visible light, like your ordinary handheld camera, multispectral imagery captures different wavelengths of light that cannot be seen with the human eye. So how does this help with famine in Africa, or really anywhere else in the world? Well, let's find out. Way back in 1972, NASA launched the first Landsat. Originally called ERTS, or the Earth Resources Technology Satellite, this satellite's mission was to study the surface of the Earth using various sensors. One of these missions was to use multispectral imaging sensors to study agricultural efforts and crop yields around the surface of the Earth. So let's dive in and see how this technology works. To simplify things, let's not look at a whole field of crops and not even an individual plant, but a single leaf. Plants are fascinating organisms, and one of the things that most people know about plants is that the substance that makes the leaves green is called chlorophyll. But in order to see that green color, or really any colors at all, we have to have light. Thinking back to third grade science class, we remember that when it comes to colors, the human eye is simply seeing the reflected light from an object. That's what gives objects their color. So when we see this leaf, or when a human eye looks at it, sunlight illuminates the leaf, bounces off of it, reflecting the color green from the chlorophyll to the human eye where it gets processed by the brain and interpreted as a color. Now, if the plant is sick or dying, the leaves will change color. Everyone that has tried to grow a bean plant on the windowsill of an elementary school classroom knows, at least once, that sinking feeling of seeing a brown, shriveled stalk of what once was a bright green bean plant. Now, this is a very oversimplified explanation of how humans visually see all objects, so let's complicate it a bit. Instead of the human eyeball here, let's replace that with a multispectral imaging sensor that can see trillions of different shades of color that the human eye can't see. And let's throw that image sensor, that camera, onto a satellite orbiting Earth. And let's hook it up to a wicked smart computer, or more accurately, a data processing center. And let's add in something else. Have you ever gone to a home improvement store and stood in the paint section looking forlornly at a handful of paint swatches, trying to discern the difference between satin white and eggshell white? We have all done that at some point. I cannot tell you how many times I have tried to visually match paint colors, only to fail and have to look up the 5 or 6 digit number code on the back of the paint sample card. A bit of interesting technology that has come out recently is that magic image sensor that can match the color of any object that you bring into the store. Quite a handy bit of technology that has become mainstream in recent years. So an image sensor is way better than the human eye when it comes to detecting colors, or more specifically, the differences between two colors. We've all seen optical illusions like this one, which make these two squares look like they're two different colors, when in actuality they are the exact same color. Most humans are tricked by this simple optical illusion, but computers and imaging sensors are not. So we put one of these bad boys into orbit and we start collecting data. When it comes to the human eye, we are really bad at determining the different shades of green that plant leaves are made of. But a multispectral imaging sensor is not. For instance, the human eye can look at two different leaves and say that they are the same color, but a fancy satellite in orbit with just a really awesome sensor can tell that this leaf is just a few thousandths of a shade darker than this leaf, and it can realize that there is something going on there with that particular leaf. So some of you might have started putting the pieces of this puzzle together and realized that some very interesting folks might be interested in this technology. A great open source use of this kind of technology is the detection of marijuana growing operations. The DEA and other agencies have invested quite a lot of money in this technology because it turns out that while the human eye just sees green leaves on plants, every single plant on Earth is actually a slightly different color. Again, it's far too small of a difference to see with the human eye in most cases, but to a sensor and a computer, which has access to a database of trillions of leaf colors, all calibrated for different times of year and the life cycles of each plant, and calibrated to the exact light reflectivity of a particular time of day, it's really easy to see the difference between, say, deciduous tree leaves and marijuana leaves. So you see how this starts coming together. One can easily then make the assumption that this technology is very useful for analyzing the light reflectivity of other substances, not just leaves. And you would be right. If you have a database that contains the magic color classification of, say, various white powders or explosives, you can see how the ministries of defense around the world might be interested in this technology. And if your military is cripplingly dependent on the utilization of unmanned aerial systems in combat, well, you'd be highly interested in this technology indeed. Enter the field of camouflage detection. As one has hopefully guessed by now, multispectral imagery is a technology that is very well suited to detecting when a leaf is not a leaf, but a piece of camouflaged fabric that is dyed, painted, or otherwise colored in such a way as to blend into its environment. And now, all of a sudden, it makes sense as to why camouflage patterns, colors, dyes, paints, and fabrics are so difficult to make. Not only does it have to be resistant to infrared sensors or night vision devices, both of which we could do entire videos on, but camouflage has to mimic the natural environment that it's in almost to a molecular level. You have to have green colors and materials that almost perfectly reflect light in the same way that chlorophyll does, or any other number of materials found in nature. So when it comes to camouflage, there really is no hiding from multispectral sensors. When the Army announced in 2018 that they would be replacing all of their camouflage netting with a new program, the Ultra Lightweight Camouflage Net System, or ULCANS, it was done with multispectral camouflage in mind. But like all camouflage attempts, it was more or less doomed to fail from the start. With nation-state espionage at an all-time high, and with private companies leaking defense technologies left and right, it would not be inaccurate to assess that Russian and Chinese agents obtained samples of this new ULCANS fabric almost immediately, probably before even the DoD got theirs. So to continue our analogy, all Russia and China have to do is put this fabric in their $1 million Home Depot paint sampler, and boom, they've got the exact reflectivity of the US Army's brand new multi-million-dollar ultra-secret camouflage netting. And they can even tailor it to different lighting patterns, different sun angles, and can even write software packages that can be used on aircraft sensor pods and adjusted for ambient lighting conditions so that if a sensor sees that particular reflected color, it will alert the sensor operator or even the pilot himself. Pretty cool technology that, while maybe not widely fielded right now, is definitely a possibility and will be fielded much more in the future. So why even bother with camouflage anyway? If multispectral imagery is so great that nothing can hide from it, why even bother with developing and spending a lot of money on camouflage? As with any technology, there are a lot of downsides. So let's go down the list of problems which can be used to evade surveillance if your adversary is known to be equipped with this technology. And that's really the first point. The adversary has to have it. Your adversary actually has to physically have the technology. Let's face it, not many entities around the world have the funding and capabilities to actually develop this technology. Sure, people like us can easily explain it in excruciatingly oversimplified detail, but when it comes to actually writing the code and funding and building the sensors, things get exponentially more difficult. So chances are your local police department or even local National Guard units don't have this technology. Next is the adequate knowledge of implementation. Even if an entity, like a nation-state or theater-level command, have access to this technology, they have to use it the right way. Think about it. You can put a $10,000 DSLR camera into the hands of a complete novice, and they might be able to figure out how to snap a couple of pictures, but you will nowhere near approach the capabilities of the actual sensor. So you've got to have the right sensor operator behind the lens getting the absolute most out of the technology that's possible. Also, along these lines, an adversary that possesses this technology must actually have the freedom to operate and use it. For instance, you can get a professional photographer and give them a great camera, but only tell them to take pictures of a garbage can and nothing else. Sure, you'll probably get some really good photos of a garbage can, but I honestly don't know of any garbage can that is a threat to national security. So if your adversary's command structure is incompetent in that they do not know how to best utilize the assets that are given to them, this is a huge advantage to anyone who is looking to evade surveillance. Next is appropriate usage. Like we mentioned earlier, this technology has extremely wide-ranging uses, from agriculture and famine prevention to counter-narco missions. But very few assets that are in current usage around the world are actually dedicated specifically to camouflage detection. So in other words, if the DEA is hunting for marijuana grow operations in your area, chances are they aren't going to find your observation post, unless your camouflage reflects light in the exact same way that marijuana does. And even so, a lot of camouflage detection efforts are still done by humans. The satellite might take the image, but in almost all cases, it's up to the human analyst to look at it. So for example, if you are setting up an observation post in a remote area, you might have a satellite or drone pass overhead. Most satellites and drones alike take images with a wide variety of sensors all at once, but most analysts just stick with the normal electro-optical sensor, i.e. the normal daylight camera, or a thermal option to see heat. Even if the aerial platform is capable of taking multispectral images, it doesn't matter if the analyst isn't looking for camouflage at the right moment. As a side note, most sensor operators around the world have gotten quite lazy because they've been following targets in the desert that don't exactly have first-hand knowledge of thermal imaging in the way that many Americans do. In other words, it's really not that hard to use an infrared thermal sensor to track an insurgent who thinks he's hidden under a bush or something. So the analyst gets sloppy and only requests platforms that can only do FLIR or thermal imagery at best, and they ignore the other capabilities like multispectral imaging because they think they don't need it. Next is sensor availability. As scary as multispectral imaging technology is when it comes to camouflage detection, we have to realize the size of these sensors. They are massive. Right now, most multispectral sensors capable of camouflage detection operations are really only on satellites or large fixed-wing platforms. We expect this to change in the next few years, with camouflage detection sensors being used at lower levels of command and not simply being theater-level assets. But for now, there are an awful lot of hoops that have to be jumped through for a military unit to be able to detect camouflage in their area. Next up is sensor resolution. Sort of related to the last point, sensor resolution is a huge issue for an adversary that might have this technology. Everyone likes to think that government satellites operate like the movie Enemy of the State, and ignoring the fact that near-nadir imagery, or imagery that is looking almost straight vertically down, is pretty much useless in the intel world. We must always laugh at the scenes that show these government satellites having incredible resolution.
It means the NSA can read the time off your wristwatch.
No, they can't. Even unmanned aerial platforms, which can obviously get closer to the target than, say, a satellite, cannot see anyone's wristwatch. Right now, there are only a couple of satellites that are even capable of taking full motion video anyway, and it doesn't take a Russian spy to figure out what the resolution is for most US military imaging satellites. Spoiler alert, it's atrocious, and the Russian and Chinese satellites are a lot worse. That's why the Army's new Olcan's camo netting program makes a lot more sense. If the resolution for a particular satellite sensor is 3 or 4 meters per pixel, well, that's enough to hide a small vehicle inside just 1 pixel. Now, granted, most satellites are a lot better than this, being far less than a meter in resolution on a good day, right? But when it comes to imaging sensors with a lot better resolution, it can be detected by multispectral imaging sensors, but that's a lot harder to see than the previous camo nets, which really only worked against the unaided human eye. So that's why the system kind of makes sense. And when it comes to an individual human being, or a small observation post or foxhole or something, trying to conceal that from a drone or even better a satellite, that's really easy to do. As we have pointed out, in the right circumstances, it is impossible to fool the sensor. But what about the analyst? As I mentioned, camouflage detection is solely dependent on a series of circumstances which all have to line up perfectly for a human analyst to even realize that deception or camouflage is taking place. Many marksmen and snipers and militaries around the world have discovered that the absolute best camouflage on the planet is the planet itself. Natural foliage will always be better than something man-made, at least for the foreseeable future. And even though fresh foliage will wilt and have to be replaced over time, a pile of wilted leaves is still much more natural looking than fresh-looking fake leaves, to an image sensor anyway. So even if camouflage efforts are automated within a computer, which is rare right now, but even so, natural foliage has the higher chance of altering the data that the sensor is seeing and placing the burden of camouflage detection on the analyst. Now the analyst has to make a judgment call. Is that dead foliage from something natural, like a parasite infestation or a drought, or is this a deliberate attempt to camouflage something? You multiply that up over a 12-hour shift and hundreds of miles scanned, and you come up with nothing, right? Remember, sensors cannot make judgment calls, nor can they make mistakes, because they cannot make decisions, but humans can. So by creating that little bit of doubt within the data that sensor is collecting, you are forcing the decision onto the human analyst, who is far more likely to make the mistake. So as one can see, the stars have to align perfectly for camouflage detection efforts to actually work well enough to be considered a significant threat. A nation-state has to have the interest in the first place, and fight through the bureaucracy and politics of higher military command structures in order to allocate the right sensor platform to the exact right place at the exact right time, and be led by the right commander with a sensor operator that has the right amount of experience using the right sensor mode and who is on top of his game at the exact moment the sensor sweeps over you. Oh, and the sensor operator has to even notice an anomaly to point out to the analyst, who then has to have the interest, skill level, time, and make the judgment call to look into it further. And even then, the analyst has to see through the deception to realize they are looking at a deliberate camouflage attempt. And if any of these circumstances are out of alignment, you will not be detected by your adversary. A lot of these intelligence collection platforms and capabilities and sensors are pretty scary stuff, especially considering the world we live in today. But one must remember the tragically hilarious irony that goes into a lot of these intelligence collection platforms, that a billion-dollar sensor, more often than not, can be defeated by something simple. A tree limb cut the right way, a cave in the ground, or even something as simple and uncontrollable as the weather. It doesn't take $1 billion worth of technology to combat $1 billion worth of technology. All it takes is a cloud in the right spot to negate billions, if not trillions of dollars worth of effort and decades worth of time. So hopefully this was a good primer on multispectral camouflage detection, providing various little bits of knowledge that you can use to counter these systems if you need to. As much as we'd like to write up a concrete list of things you can do to evade this or other types of surveillance, the stark reality is that it is far better to learn about the technology so that one can apply it to their specific situation and environment. The Earth has a pretty diverse landscape. So by understanding the overall doctrine and larger themes, one can develop their own practices that work in their specific areas, which is far better than having a pocket full of raw tactics but no understanding of how to implement them in each specific situation. So thanks for watching, everyone, and we will see you next time. And always remember, fight in the shade. Or maybe in the bushes.